ago, we received a wedding invitation in the mail. It was for the wedding for a few friends of ours. They're getting married in November. This invitation was beautiful. The envelope was this lovely shade of cream. It was offset by the handwritten calligraphy on the front. It's sort of refreshing to me to get a piece of mail like this in the midst of all of the junk mail that usually fills my mailbox. Plus, I was just very excited for my friends and their upcoming celebration. But my admiration for this particular piece of mail was cut short when I looked at how it was addressed. Mr. and Mrs. J.T. Longino, it read. It made me wince a little bit. Now, I'm a big fan of etiquette and formality, don't get me wrong. I love when things are traditionally done. But this particular form of address pains me. When a piece of mail is addressed to Mr. and Mrs. J.T. Longino, I have a hard time finding my identity in that. Now, I had already made the decision to let go of my maiden name. That was a choice of convenience, I guess you could say. But when a piece of mail is addressed like this, it reduces me down to just that little 3-letter abbreviation, Mrs. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a wife. I want to make that clear. I have no qualms with being identified as JT's wife, so long as there's an acknowledgement that I'm still my own person. I still have my own identity. I still have my own title as Reverend. This is why I love getting mail from the seminary. They always do it just right. They know how to address pastors. When I get a piece of mail from the seminary, it reads, the Reverend Rebecca Longino and Mr. J.T. Longino. They know how to do it. They know that regardless of gender, the person with the title gets listed first. Now, J.T. couldn't care less about this. He has no insecurities about being listed second or not having a title. But this is something that kind of gets me riled up, especially when I'm just reduced to that Mrs. It deletes everything else about me. So when I opened up the invitation, I pulled out that RSVP card and I debated how to fill it out. They went through the trouble of addressing it so formally. Clearly, this matters to them. So surely they would have an appreciation if I returned the favor. My husband thought I was being a little too snarky about this, which is probably true. I sat there with that card and I debated, how should I fill this out? I wanted to do the proper formal way with my name first, his name second, but the trouble is that they had the little M with that blank line that I never used to know what to do with. Turns out it's for the Mr. or Miss, and then you fill in the rest of your name. Well, if I was going to do this right, my name should come first, which would mean Reverend. I'd have to cross out that little M, and that just seems kind of rude. So I compromised. I decided, well, I'll put his name first, I'll fill out the M with Mr., and then I'll put the Reverend Rebecca. Yes, I was being very snarky about this. I was making it a much bigger deal than it probably needed to be. But as I sat there thinking about this was about so much more than just me and my snarkiness about my title. I thought of all of the women whose titles are questioned or ignored or deleted. The reverends, the doctors, the honorables. I thought of all of the women who are not given the respect that they deserve when they have a title. And so I filled out that RSVP card thinking about all of those women. All of the women who face discrimination just for their gender. I thought about women in the church, the reality that we have in the Presbyterian church even. I saw a recent survey that came out that said that 84% of women pastors face discrimination, harassment, prejudice. 84% of our female pastors. I couldn't believe this number. It just felt so outrageous in 2016. Now, when I hear things out in the public sector about women being called certain names, the way that they're talked about from public officials, I admit I'm not that surprised. That's how the world is. But I would think in the church that we would do better, that we would be better. But women in authority, women in the church, women sitting in the pews, still face this harsh condition on a daily basis. I could give a few more examples from my journey in ministry. This recent one with the wedding invitation was relatively harmless, but it was just the one in most recent memory. But there are some awful things that happen to women in the church today. Much like the generations of women that have come before us. I think of all of those trailblazers, those first women to enroll in seminary, back when seminaries didn't even have women's restrooms to accommodate them. When they were told not to distract the men in class. I know Pastor Trish has a few more stories, and I'm sure Lydia does too. The struggle of women in ministry and in leadership gets even worse as we go back through history. We turn the pages and we see women fighting for the right to work, to vote, to own property. It's been a struggle. These are some privileges that many women in the world still don't have. We know that's true. If we go back way further, back to ancient Israel, we see that women were hardly even considered human. They hardly had any rights of their own. This is why this situation is so dismal for the woman in our story for today. Luke sets up this parable by saying it speaks to our need to pray always and to not lose heart. No doubt this is a message that the disciples needed to hear. They live in uncertain times. Their world is full of turmoil. It is hard to live in that time. Following Jesus is a dangerous path. The cost of discipleship is great. As they make their way toward Jerusalem, they don't know what they're going to encounter. They hear Herod plans to kill Jesus, and yet they go there unarmed. They clearly need this reminder to pray always and not lose heart. So Jesus, as usual, tells them a parable to help them understand. There are two characters, the woman, who is a widow, and this unjust, cruel judge. Now, we don't know what injustice the woman faced. We aren't told the details about it. We know that she has an opponent. There's just no mention of what they have done. Perhaps her landlord is being unfair. Maybe someone has stolen from her. Maybe something worse. Whatever the issue is, it is causing her big pain. It is disrupting her life. She does not feel safe. And so she approaches this judge. She wants to seek justice. She hopes that he will hear her plea, that he will grant her mercy. Unfortunately for her, he is not a nice, compassionate judge. He is a ruthless judge. He doesn't really care for people, so he has no interest in helping this woman. He views her as a nuisance, as a pest. And yet she is relentless. Day after day, she approaches him, begging him for mercy, hoping he will hear her case, asking him to advocate for her when no one else will. Now we have to remember, she is a widow, so she has no man in her life that can speak up for her. At this time, women weren't really supposed to speak up for themselves. They needed a husband or a son to get by. She has no husband or son. So she's left to her own devices. She takes it upon herself to find justice. She reminds me a lot of a woman named Hilda, who lives here in Austin. Hilda is an indigenous woman from Guatemala. She came to the U.S. with her son 2 years ago. They fled unspeakable violence. I don't want to know the details. I'm sure it's horrifying. And they came here to find refuge and safety. Like thousands of other women and children, they were sent through that complicated immigration process. They spent months in a detention center before they were released, awaiting their trial. They found a community here in Austin, and they started to rebuild their lives. But at one point in the process, the threat of deportation became very real. Hilda realized she had to take action if she was going to keep her family safe. So she sought help. She went to local organizers, people who had been working with refugees. She was taken in by our neighbors up at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. They offered her sanctuary, so she literally lived in the church. She and her son couldn't leave for fear of being deported as soon as she walked out the door. Despite all of these obstacles, Hilda kept on fighting. She did everything she could to ensure the safety for herself and her son. And her relentless efforts have paid off, because just this week, she was granted a deferred action decision, which means she and her son can stay for the time being. This is remarkable. I cannot even fathom how scary that process must have been, and she was so courageous. And the folks at that church were so hospitable. Well, Hilda's story is similar to thousands of women who have fled Central America. It's one of the most dangerous regions in the world. It's similar to what families are facing in Syria right now, all of those refugees seeking safety. Oftentimes, they are left on their own to navigate that complicated system, to figure out a way to relocate and rebuild. Oftentimes, they have no one to speak on their behalf. They don't even know where to start to find safety. Oftentimes, they are deported back to where they came from, back to that grim reality of violence. Hilda's is a rather rare scenario. I think she has a unique feistiness about her that would not let her give up. This helped her find justice. She has a lot in common with the woman in our story for today. In this parable, we hear of this woman facing an injustice, and we see this cruel judge who just won't hear her. Jesus tells this story in contrast to God's character. God is not like this cruel judge, the one who ignores the pleas of the vulnerable, the one who only grants justice out of annoyance to get rid of that nuisance. God is a just judge. God is a compassionate judge, even when the world is not so compassionate. Pray always and don't lose heart, the parable tells us. Don't give up that hope and that pursuit of justice, it reminds us. So what does it look like to pray always? Does this mean that 24/7 we should be bowing down, heads lowered, hands folded, constantly in conversation with God? Well, that's not what the woman in our parable did. In fact, we don't ever actually hear of her praying for justice. We don't actually see her talking to God and asking for a right situation. She takes action. That is her form of prayer. Her relentless pursuit of justice was her way of praying. This was her way of seeking what was right. The parable that we read today suggests that prayer can go beyond what we usually think of it as. Prayer can look like action. That relentless pursuit of justice, of making things right, can be our way of praying, of making things good. God calls us to action. We see this over and over again, especially in the New Testament. It's a big part of what the kingdom of God is about. We hear Jesus call us to feed the hungry, to care for the sick, to help the marginalized. In a few moments, we're going to read together part of the brief statement of faith. We will be reminded that we are called to hear the voices of those long silenced, to work with others for justice, freedom, and peace. As we do this work of prayer, we trust that God is a good judge, that he will respond with justice. We trust that all prayers are heard, all actions are noticed. Jesus calls us to pray always and not lose heart, trusting that God will intervene, that justice will be granted. And we live with that hope that the Spirit is with us always, guiding that work. We must not lose heart. We must maintain that spirit of determination, just like the woman in our parable for today. Just like Hilda, who has found refuge here in Austin. We cannot give up when things look hopeless. Rather, faithfully praying and working for justice, we will seek reconciliation for the world. We must remember that one day we will find a new heaven and a new earth, one in which injustice and suffering is no more. Amen. But until then, let us pray always and not lose heart. Amen. Amen.